Humanity has fought many battles, many that we have won, some we have lost. However, it seems that no matter how much innovation we bring into the world, a demon continues to haunt us, one that infects and kills without remorse. This demon brings fever, chills, sweating, many other symptoms of vexation. Even when it wanes, it soon returns to claim its victim. We have defeated the forces that bring the most intense maladies, those that paralyze, melt organs, and cause one to go mad. No matter how hard we try, our most personal and historic demon, to this day, claims its victims in innumerable quantities. Through the course of human history, our largest threat has never been the creatures of the night, the harshest heat and cold, not even ourselves. It has conquered kings and empires, bringing monuments of humanity's greatness to its knees. It has steered and laid the tracks for a most ever-present humanitarian and political strife, even to this day. There are around 200 species in the genus Plasmodium, a microscopic parasite that infects many species of mammal, bird, and reptile. Of those 200 or so species, only 4 target humans. Those 4 species have been plaguing humanity for as long as we have existed on this earth. The colonial Spanish called it cisiones, a word that is largely lost today. They describe it as a fever that comes with chills, which is attributed to the cierzo, or mistral wind, because it is the most acute, cold, and penetrating. But no matter what you call it, its name strikes fear in all. Cisiones, tertian fever, malaria. Of all 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, plague, war, famine, and death, there's a reason the first horseman leads the way.
Well, that was dramatic. I like making intense stuff like that. It's fun. But it's sort of emblematic of it all. There is no disease in human history that has had a larger impact than malaria. It is pretty easy to ignore in our industrialized, prosperous bubbles, but to this day, malaria still wreaks havoc all around the world. Before we get into the main content, I'd like to urge you all to donate to one, if not both, of the charities I've linked in the description. Over 600,000 people still die of malaria each year, most under the age of 5. Luckily, it is a preventable disease, and these charities provide assistance to at-risk people by donating mosquito netting and bringing vital treatment for malaria symptoms to children. I'd highly suggest that you go and donate even a little bit. One mosquito net costs as little as $2, so a small donation could save several lives. I've already vetted these organizations and they are reliable. This is a crucial time to help, especially since there is a looming threat of USAID being defunded significantly, who spends almost $1 billion annually to help prevent the disease. So any donation amount would be a massive help. Okay, public service announcement over. We're going to start here. This is a Plasmodium, a single-cell parasite. As a single-celled organism, it may seem simple and primitive even, but this little guy will go through a fascinating life cycle. It is often difficult to imagine diseases in a biological sense, especially since we don't see most of the small organisms that cause them, like how it's impossible for our brains to imagine exponentials. However, unlike many ailments, the vector often makes itself quite obvious. Yeah, you hear that? Y'all hate that sound. Let's get a culprit up close. The humble mosquito. They have a serious habit of getting way too close to your face, nose, ears, and making an awful noise. And they also make themselves known with their painful bite. Every single human that has ever existed has had to deal with these little buggers. In fact, every organism that has been around for the last 190 million years has had to deal with them. Our earliest evidence of these guys coming from fossilized amber from the Cretaceous period. For that almost 200 million year period, mosquitoes have been extremely good at their jobs. Before we get to Plasmodium though, let's look at how their method of transportation functions. Here's our subject, specifically the species Anopheles, more specifically the subspecies Malcupenis, even more specifically a female, as only females collect blood. Its anatomy is pretty basic. It's largely unchanged for millions of years. Its basic features: the head, the thorax, the wings, the abdomen, 3 pairs of legs, large compound eyes, and the proboscis. That's where the magic happens. Mosquitoes tend to feed near dusk and usually prefer to latch on and feed closer to the ground. She'll likely hover around you for a few seconds using her thermal detecting eyes and sensitivity to carbon dioxide to locate you and your prime blood vessel, where she can extract the most blood. They're so small and light that you likely won't even notice she's there. Probably not that one. I'd hope you'd notice. This is where things get icky, and I'm sorry. I was so itchy writing this part of the script. Once the mosquito has landed on the prime blood-sucking spot, she'll lift her abdomen into the air and zero in. From our point of view, a mosquito sucking your blood might seem like them just sticking a needle straw into you and sucking out your blood. But it's more complicated than that. There's actually 5 essential steps in the nutrient collection process, including 6 different body parts, all of which stabby needles, unfortunately. Step 1. Once she is zeroed in, she uses 2 mandible-cutting blades to saw into your skin towards your blood vessel. Step 2. 2 retractors push open a passage for the proboscis, which is the hypodermic syringe part. Step 3. The proboscis emerges from a protective sheath and stabs into your blood vessel. Step 4. She sucks out about 3 to 5 milligrams of blood, and all the while the 6th needle pumps saliva into your blood that contains an anticoagulant, preventing your blood from clotting at the puncture site, allowing for a consistent flow of blood. Step 5. As she ingests your blood, she immediately separates the water from it and excretes it from her body, while gathering the 20% protein content from it, keeping it to grow her eggs. After this process, which can be remarkably quick, she leaves, and the anticoagulant in your blood causes a small allergic reaction, making the puncture site very itchy. She's then off to find another host to feed on and collect protein from. That's the whole reason the females drink blood. The protein from the collected blood is required to grow her eggs. Putting it like that kind of makes me feel sympathy for them in a way. Not for very long. The males, all the while, are focused on only 2 things: nectar and mating. Word. And they are indeed pollinators, but according to this study, their role as pollinators is pretty much negligible, as they don't focus much on similar types of flowers. They take what they can get, which can occasionally lead to meaningful as well as random, inconsequential pollination. I should have mentioned this in my last video, which, by the way, how did that do? Oh my god. Okay. Thank you all for that. Seriously. Interestingly, according to the same study, in general, the only plants who genuinely benefit from mosquito pollination are harmful invasive weeds associated with humans, because of course. All right, let's get back to that nasty bite from earlier, because good lord, is it itchy. Usually mosquito bites are nothing to worry about, but for us, we just happen to be on a vacation in the wonderful and beautiful landscape of Central Africa. That mosquito bite just transmitted one of over 15 diseases, which can be separated into 3 different groups: worms, viruses, and protozoans or parasites. Since gambling is awesome, let's take a poll. Please don't gamble, it's dumb. Also, not all mosquito bites will transmit a disease. Looks like we rolled Zika. We're potentially in for the classic set of symptoms: fever, muscle aches, perhaps a little conjunctivitis. What else could we have gotten? Yellow fever, dengue, chikungunya, and the big ticket item. This group of diseases that make up the absolute worst blunt rotation of all time are known as arboviruses, or diseases transmitted to humans through an arthropod vector like gnats, ticks, and mosquitoes. About 75% of all diseases in humans occurred at some point through a process called zoonosis, in which diseases are naturally transmitted from animals to humans, including but not at all limited to rabies, Lyme disease, avian flu, and many more. Got a sick Austin in elaboration here for you. Arboviruses are nothing new. Dinosaurs were plagued by them all the way back in the Jurassic period, and they have been targeting humans as long as we have existed on this earth. According to Timothy C. Weingard, author of The Mosquito: A Human History of Our Deadliest Predator, given our extreme amount of genetic similarity between us and our ape cousins, around 20% of our diseases were not only transferred from them, but are also shared by them. Also, definitely go check out that book. It's really helped my research for this. We're going to go back to our group of arboviruses here. Look at them. Probably talking about me behind my back. Jerks. Anyways, out of all of these and the many other not mentioned examples of arboviruses, none have targeted us quite like this one. Here's where this gets juicy. This, my friends, is a Plasmodium. First appearing in the paleological record around 130 million years ago, this little bugger has been our worst enemy as not only humans but primates for 6 to 8 million years. In the three groups of mosquito-borne diseases, it stands alone in the parasite category. It is, according to the evidence we have, the oldest and deadliest parasite in our history as a genus. But why? Did a lot of setup for just like a 10-minute segment.
So let's say, instead of contracting Zika, we managed to contract the Plasmodium parasite. In order to understand the parasite, we have to look at how it works. To give you a quick idea of how much you're in for, especially regarding parasites, just listen to what Scottish biologist Henry Drummond had to say in 1883 regarding them, quote, "Parasites are a breach in the law of evolution and the greatest crime against humanity." If you've been paying attention, you might remember that the mosquito that bit us earlier was of the species Anopheles. And that is no coincidence. Anopheles is the only species of mosquito that can carry Plasmodium, and only 70 of the 480 species of Anopheles can do so. There are actually a pretty insane amount of malaria parasites that infect animals, over 450 different types. Only 4 of those infect humans. Technically, there are 5 types in the human-killing category, but the 5th, Plasmodium knowlesi, primarily appears in other primates, likely the macaque in Southeast Asia, with human cases having unclear methods of transmission. We gotta stop having sex with the monkeys, guys. So 2 other types, Plasmodium ovale and malariae, along with knowlesi, are extremely rare, ovale and malariae being confined to West Africa, all having relatively mild symptoms. Well, what about the other types? Yeah, you better hope you got lucky and caught one of the first 3. If you most likely didn't, well, how do I put this? I'd first like to say that I'm sorry. Depending on how bad it is, do you want Spider-Man or John Cena to visit you in the hospital? So Plasmodium falciparum and Plasmodium vivax, 2 names I guarantee you will dread by the end of this. These 2 are the biggest player in our war with malaria. Let's get into what makes them so awful. The Plasmodium, before being introduced into your blood, was actually inside the mosquito for quite a bit. After being picked up, the Plasmodium spends about 10 to 14 days reproducing, where it then waits inside the salivary glands of the mosquito. It is introduced in step 4 in our anticoagulant-laced saliva. Once inside the bloodstream, it does some pretty remarkable work. So first stop, your liver. Get our science hats on, ladies and gentlemen. It's time to get our microbiology freak on. By the way, I'll have vocab words at the bottom of the video if I don't have time to get to it, to hopefully eliminate confusion. So when first injected, the malaria parasite is in its infectious stage, called sporozoites. This is the start of the exoerythrocytic cycle. After traveling through the bloodstream long enough to reach your liver, they settle down in the liver sinusoid, which is, here's what Wikipedia says. A liver sinusoid is a type of capillary known as a sinusoidal capillary, discontinuous capillary, or sinusoid that is primarily to a fenestrated capillary having discontinuous endothelium that serves as a location for mixing the oxygen-rich blood from the hepatic artery and the nutrient-rich blood from the portal vein. Jesus. Okay, basically the sporozoites make their way to the part of the liver that is responsible for mixing the nutrients and oxygen-rich blood. While in the sinusoid, they make their way out of blood circulation by infecting hepatocytes, which are basically the main liver cells. Their method of doing so is not very well understood actually, but what is known is that the sporozoites use molecular receptors to trick the cell into letting it inside. In the cell, the sporozoites wait a bit, maturing into a different form called merozoites, through asexual reproduction. The resulting cell holding them is called a schizont. When they are ready, they break open the cell wall, killing the cell and releasing merozoites, which are built to infect red blood cells, or erythrocytes. When they invade the red blood cells, it starts the erythrocytic cycle. In the blood cell, the merozoites mature into immature trophozoites. This is called the ring stage, and one of two things can happen. They can mature into mature trophozoites after they consume the hemoglobin in the red blood cell, which carries the oxygen in the cell. They use this energy to create new schizons, where it reproduces asexually and produces up to 36 merozoites. So after 2 days, the schizont then ruptures, releasing more merozoites, which infect more red blood cells and begin the cycle again. This consistent infection, multiplication, and killing of cells is what causes the main symptoms of malaria. This activity almost acts as a beacon for mosquitoes to notice and bite you. However, some of the merozoites inside the blood cells don't develop into schizons, but rather begin differentiating into male and female gametocytes. These gametocytes float around your bloodstream until another mosquito comes along, sucking your blood at the right time, and ingesting one of these gametocytes. The life cycle then continues inside the mosquito. So in order to survive the transition from your blood to the mosquito's gut, the male and female gametocytes go through a rapid process of very specific gene expression, essentially changing form. It's a little more complicated than that, obviously, but it's all way out of my wheelhouse. In the gut, the male and female gametocytes transition into gametes, which then, like an egg and sperm in humans, fuse together to form a zygote. These zygotes then transition and differentiate into an eukaryote. The eukaryote is kind of awful for the mosquito. It is incredibly invasive and very fast and invades the epithelial cell wall of the mosquito to form an oocyst. The oocyst then produces thousands of sporozoites in the process called sporogeny. These sporozoites then migrate to the mosquito's salivary glands, waiting for the mosquito to bite and inject its anticoagulant saliva into a vertebrate host, hopefully not you. With that, the life cycle of the Plasmodium is complete. I hope that wasn't too confusing because it was for me. But now hopefully we understand just how effective and incredibly complex this parasite is. Its evolutionary adaptations are pretty impressive, honestly. The fact that it can spread itself in your blood while at the same time creating new transmittable plasmodiums is pretty insane. All of this is very synchronized inside your body due to certain chemical signals and follows a strict schedule. A single infection can produce up to 10 billion new parasites. During the erythrocytic cycle, where red blood cells are infected and killed to produce more merozoites, which are released in a synchronized attack that comes suddenly and hits hard, as the body sets off its usual defense mechanism. The immune system fights back against the parasites by making your body's temperature fluctuate. You'll experience some pretty gnarly fever and chills, as well as muscle aches, vomiting, fatigue, sweating, and more. Eventually, the parasite is beaten back by the tried and true fever and chills method, which always works, unless it doesn't. You'll start feeling better, but don't get too comfortable. Symptoms will return in a couple of days, as another coordinated attack on your blood cells begins again. You'll probably have to go through this hellish cycle a few times, but eventually your immune system will fight off the parasite for good. Or did it? Before we get into the ominous question, let's go into the two deadliest strains of Plasmodium. Shout out yerba mate. So how do Plasmodium vivax and falciparum find so much success? Well, these two strains have come across some pretty interesting adaptations. Vivax is the better or less bad of the two. During infection, it goes through the same song and dance as the other strains, but it tends to leave victims extremely weak, stuporous, which essentially means you're super out of it, almost unconscious, and anemic. These symptoms leave sufferers not as likely to die from the Plasmodium infection itself, but easy prey for other diseases. Somewhat rarely can cause complications that can lead to organ failure and ARDS, or acute respiratory distress syndrome. Here's the messed up part. Once your rounds of malaria are over, it's possible, common even, for dormant versions of the virus to hide out in your liver, occasionally springing back up for another attack. For vivax infections, these relapses can occur every now and then for up to 2 to 5 years.
Vivax sucks.
Rabies. Ugh.
But it's a league behind its cousin, Plasmodium falciparum. Unlike vivax, falciparum, after inserting itself into your red blood cells, can alter them to make them lodge themselves inside the capillaries of your kidneys, lungs, brain, and other organs. Capillaries, if you remember, are small blood vessels that connect your artery to your veins, a crucial point in your circulatory system for oxygen and nutrient transfer. Falciparum does this as a method to conceal itself from your immune system, but as a result, it tends to slowly accumulate more and more of these infected cells inside your capillary. Layer upon layer, it can completely block circulation in multiple points in your body. You can probably guess, since you're smart, that that's bad. The result of this is that 1 of every 10 falciparum victims die of organ failure. Falciparum accumulation in the capillaries can even affect pregnancies, as the buildup of the infected cells in the woman's placenta can cause low birth weight, anemia, miscarriages, even something called congenital malaria, where the mother passes on her infection to the unborn child, which can cause problems in the newborn like hepatosplenomegaly, enlargement of the liver, and spleen simultaneously, which can lead to hypertension and infection, anemia, and thrombocytopenia, which causes low platelet counts in the infant's blood, making it difficult to clot. Symptoms often set in at around 5.5 weeks, but cases of congenital malaria are quite rare. Only about 7.5% of non-immune mothers pass it on, and only 0.3% of immune mothers pass it. While vivax infections throw you for a loop every once in a while for about 2 to 5 years, falciparum infections can last up to a decade if you're unlucky, the longest confirmed case being 13 years. That is insane. Pretty much the entire duration of your stint with malaria symptoms, you are contagious. At any point, a mosquito can come bite you and spread the parasite even further. In 2022, the CDC estimated that over 608,000 people died of malaria, 95% of those deaths being in Africa, most of which being children under the age of 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. This is why I once again highly suggest donating at least $2 to the charities mentioned earlier. Malaria is brutal and awful, but preventable. If we all donate a little, we can make a genuine difference for communities who really need it, especially the children. There are medications to treat it, but they are not evenly distributed, and there is no vaccine. Again, links in the description, and also links to all the medical journal research that made this explanation possible. Science is cool. We all need it. Our war with Plasmodium has lasted for meganums, which is like millennia, but for millions of years. Pretty cool. It has unfortunately been a losing battle for us. One estimate from the journal Nature from 2002 estimated that around 50 to 60 billion people have been killed by malaria in our time on Earth. That's billion.
With a B.
That is an unimaginable amount of people, almost half or over half of all humans that have ever existed. That sucks, to put it plainly, but to our credit, we've thrown a couple pretty effective wrenches in the malaria machine. Our weapon of choice? Evolution, which is real and awesome, and if you try to say otherwise, you'll be endowed with the honorary clown emoji of shame. I'm sorry that there is so much noise. It is currently bird season. I love birds, but Jesus Christ, they're so loud. We're back at the olive tree again. So firstly, let's talk about Duffy antigen negativity. Duffy is a glycoprotein present in your blood cells that is a receptor for chemicals secreted by the cells during inflammation, but also acts as a receptor that Plasmodium vivax uses to invade the cell to get to that yummy oxygen-carrying hemoglobin. But about 97,000 years ago in Africa, one person had a genetic mutation that didn't allow the Duffy glycoprotein to function properly. Without being able to use the Duffy receptor to access the red blood cells, Plasmodium vivax couldn't infect this individual properly. With this acquired immunity and now higher chance of passing on their genes, this individual passed on the mutation for Duffy negativity. Now today, 97% of West and Central Africans carry the mutation, making them impervious to vivax and Plasmodium knowlesi. Some communities, like the Pygmy people of Central Africa, are roughly 100% Duffy negative. So that was our answer to vivax and knowlesi. What about falciparum? Well, that is a more recent play. About 7,300 years ago in Africa, an individual acquired a genetic mutation affecting the hemoglobin itself, which made the blood cells crescent or sickle-shaped. This was the first appearance of Sickle Cell, that pioneering individual now known as Sickle Cell Eve. There's no fancy tricks with this one. It's all about the shape. Instead of a donut or oval, the blood cell's new sickle shape simply can't be grabbed onto by Plasmodium falciparum. It also potentially makes the cell produce carbon monoxide, which has been proven to protect against malaria. Those who have the hereditary sickle cell trait are 90% immune from falciparum infection. The rise in this mutation actually coincided with the spread of agriculture in West and Central Africa. Roughly 8,000 years ago, the Bantu migrations occurred in Africa, who began to cultivate plantains and yams. The spread of agriculture disturbed landscapes along the Nile Delta and the Congo River. Are you fucking kidding me right now? The spread of agriculture disturbed landscapes along the Nile Delta and Congo River that brought these people into contact with Plasmodium falciparum for the first time, and it latched on hard. But luckily, within only 700 years, we had played our hand and gained immunity through sickle cell. These mutations were a godsend. But it was through the monkey's paw. You see, Duffy Negativity and Sickle Cell both come with some pretty bad downsides. Those with Duffy Negativity seem to have a predisposition to things like asthma, pneumonia, various cancers, and even a 40% higher susceptibility to HIV. Monkey's paw going. Sickle cell trait can cause the odd joint and muscle pain, kidney problems, and some experience chronic fatigue and have a higher susceptibility to blood clots, along with a few other symptoms. But other than those, it's generally considered to be a pretty benign condition. But let's get to the bad side. We gotta pull up a Punnett square. I hate these. If you have sickle cell trait, your offspring have a 50% chance of inheriting the mutation. But say that both of your parents had sickle cell trait, you would have a 25% chance of inheriting both of those genes. Individuals born with sickle cell genes from both parents inherit what is known as sickle cell disease, which is essentially an inherited death sentence. So, sickle cell trait, one gene, leads to more benign symptoms. Two sickle cell trait genes leads to sickle cell disease. There's an oak tree right there. And you can probably hear it, but there's like 1 trillion blackbirds in there right now. Cool guys, I like them. Prior to modern medicine, those with sickle cell disease had an average lifespan of only 23 years. A decent trade-off a few thousand years ago, that's long enough to have some kids, but not today. But here's where it gets really bad. Normally, being born with one sickle cell gene or having sickle cell trait means that you can live a full and healthy life, and in developed countries, it is more likely those with sickle cell disease will live to adulthood. But those in places like sub-Saharan Africa are not so lucky. 50 to 90% die before adulthood, most before the age of 5. Monkey's paw, again. This is all due to the mutation itself. It occurs in the beta globin gene, which is essential for the regular production of hemoglobin, which again is what your blood cells use to carry oxygen to the rest of your body. The mutation occurs on only one letter, turning guanine adenine guanine to guanine thymine guanine. This is called a single base pair point mutation. Essentially, this substitutes the amino acid glutamic acid, normally coded with GAG, with valine, or GTG. Glutamic acid is hydrophilic, meaning it likes water, while valine is hydrophobic, meaning it doesn't like water. I, on the other hand, am homophobic. This mutation to valine makes the cell produce hemoglobin S, when it normally produces hemoglobin A. I'm going to oversimplify a lot here, so stick with me because I am just as confused as you are. Basically, the normal blood cells are very inviting to water, which is aided by their oval shape and flexibility. But the substitution of hydrophilic glutamic acid with hydrophobic valine makes the cell hate water. So once the mutated cell drops off an oxygen molecule, the water in the blood's plasma forces it to attempt to hide inside its own cell. This causes the not-so-flexible hemoglobin S to tighten up, which creates the rigid sickle shape. This stiff shape is very sticky and doesn't move smoothly through the bloodstream and tends to get stuck and bunch up inside of blood vessels, creating blood clots. This, along with the relative inefficiency with carrying oxygen, sickle cells don't allow enough oxygen to get to the rest of the body. This can lead to necrosis and intense organ failure. NFL safety Ryan Clark, who you probably heard about in school, almost died from this condition in 2007 after his spleen and gallbladder experienced tissue death. He and the Steelers were coming back from a game in Denver where oxygen is low due to the high altitude. Luckily, he lived and actually helped the Steelers to a Super Bowl within the next season. One day, Brock. I promise. Please. Can't take this anymore. So it seems even when we attempt to fight back against Plasmodium and its various strains, it still wins, watching us die in the same way it would have chosen to torture us. It's our eternal enemy for a reason. So we've gone through the parasite's life cycle, how it works, how we've tried to fight it. That was probably the most in-depth explanation I've ever done of anything, but now let's get to the good stuff and take a look at just how much this disease has steered the course of human history. The true effect of malaria on human history is understandably impossible to know for certain. It has been killing us and our ancestors for millions of years, and since its symptoms are sort of basic when it comes to diseases, it can be difficult to discern if evidence is mentioning it specifically. You don't technically have malaria unless you express symptoms, said symptoms caused by the infection and spread of the Plasmodium parasite in your body. But we do have some pretty solid evidence of the disease spread and role in human history. To give you an idea of how prevalent it was, the consensus on what caused diseases for a long time was miasma, or bad-smelling air. That's what the beaks on the plague doctors' masks were for. They would shove flowers and herbs up there to prevent the bad-smelling air from getting to them. It's honestly not a bad assumption, considering the lack of germ theory. The word malaria comes from the Roman words mal and area, literally meaning bad air. This disease was so prevalent that it got stuck with the blanket term for all disease as its name. But like I said, the lack of uniqueness of symptoms associated with malaria makes it difficult to pinpoint in a historical and archaeological context, but it has left clues. For example, infections from falciparum and knowlesi begin with a 24-hour cycle of symptoms, with the fever spiking once a day. This has historically been referred to as quotidian fever. Eventually, falciparum and knowlesi joined the ovale and vivax strains in a 48-hour fever cycle, dubbed tertian fever. Plasmodium malariae adheres to its own 72-hour fever cycle called quartan fever. Before you Roman Empire nerds out there comment, these fever names, quotidian, tertian, and quartan, adhere to the Roman practice of beginning at day 1 instead of 0. So instead of quo meaning 2, tertian meaning 3, and quartan meaning 4, just move those numbers back 1. It feels intentionally misleading, but whatever, English is stupid. So using these specific fever cycles, it can be easy to find what strain is mentioned in archaeological texts. One other way of looking for mentions of a particularly distended spleen in evident sign of malaria. I had a bit of a hard time figuring out where to start here, but I think we should begin here. Mesopotamian texts mention malaria many times. The earliest found comes from 3200 BCE in Sumeria, where tablets found between the Tigris and Euphrates attribute symptoms of malaria to the Babylonian god of the underworld, Nergal. While perhaps not mentioning malaria specifically, evil demons and spirits across history have been associated with mosquitoes and other insects. Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, are insects from Canaanite and Philistine pantheons and later in Hebrew and Christian scripture. Evil demons of Zoroastrianism represented as flies and mosquitoes, and don't forget Baal, later adapted into the Carthaginian pantheon and may actually be a precursor to Beelzebub. The Old Testament often depicts divine punishments as plagues of insects and disease, and possibly mentions malaria up to 4 different times. It's very possible that malaria had a large foothold in the Middle East and Egypt by the time of the presumed Jewish exodus from Egypt around 1225 BCE. Egyptians had been making reliefs of mosquitoes for a long time before that. So evidence of Plasmodium antigens in bones as old as 9,000 years have been found in Turkey, even in the bones of King Tutankhamun, and it has been suggested that he died from complications of malaria and an infected broken leg.
That poor guy was more inbred than Conan O'Brien. And even in the earliest Egyptian papyrus medical text from 2200 BCE, malaria or swamp fever is mentioned. Ancient Chinese medical texts also refer to the characteristic fever cycles associated with malaria, believing the symptoms to be caused by an imbalance of qi, or energy force, and a disturbance in the balance of yin and yang. Shout out Kung Fu Panda. So it's clear that we have had an understanding that mosquitoes cause diseases and have been recording the hellish experience of malaria for thousands of years. So let's skip ahead a little and get into at least what I believe to be malaria's best work in curving human history. How did Western ideas spread so well? Is a common question in historical circles. Many point to the feats of this guy. He was called many things, but you know him simply as Alexander the Great. A brilliant general, of course, but as you may expect, his success cannot be attributed to him alone. He had help from allies of the plaguing variety that would help him conquer the known world and would spell his end as well. In many ways, his path to success was paved through malaria. After the ass-kicking by means of sea people, as well as the many other factors that contributed to the ancient Dark Ages or Bronze Age collapse, two main civilizations rose from the ashes, Greece and Persia. This would become the greatest rivalry of the ancient world. Persia would rise to become the most dominant power on Earth, homing around half of the entire world's population, that is insane. The empire reached far, encroaching on Greek territory. In 499 BCE, an Athenian-sponsored group of Iberian Greeks mutinied against the Persians, then led by Darius I. Needless to say, they got their asses kicked. So to retaliate in 492 BCE, Darius decided to invade Greece, which would put control of the Mediterranean commerce in Persian hands. And they marched on Thrace and Macedonia, but the invasion didn't go as planned. As they continued south toward Athens, the Persian navy was hit by storms and its land forces were forced to retreat due to what is hypothesized to be diseases like typhoid, dysentery, and malaria. In 490 BCE, Darius launched a second campaign into Greece, landing an amphibious assault at Marathon, where the Athenians managed to confine the Persian army of 26,000 strong to low-lying, marshy encampments. Soon after, the army began to be thinned by disease, leading to their defeat and around 6,400 Persians dying from battle and disease. They would then move to attack Athens, where they would turn back before any fighting. But the Persians weren't done. In 480 BCE, Emperor Xerxes would invade with an army of 400,000 men. Their initial battles were successful, with the Persians burning down Athens. Because of this impulsiveness in burning Athens, Xerxes was denied any sort of negotiation. Outraged by this, he ordered his men to march to Salamis, where the remaining Greek and Spartan fleet had escaped to, but this is where their luck turned. After a clever trap incapacitated the Persian army, the massive army was forced to lay siege to many small villages. In order to do this, they had to traverse through massive marshes, where the mosquitoes came to play. Malaria, with a side of dysentery, soon killed 40% of the Persian army, where they were eventually defeated decisively at the Battle of Plataea, shifting the balance of power westward. This would launch Greece into its so-called Golden Age. But not all that glitters is gold, shout out Smash Mouth. Sometimes what glitters is the stagnant water where mosquitoes breed and eventually kill you with diseases. Greece went through many malaria epidemics in this time. The Athenian siege of Syracuse was halted due to 70% of the army being incapacitated or killed by malaria. Malarial outbreaks in South Greece crippled them so much that it led to King Philip II of Macedon taking over the entirety of the peninsula. When he ruled, his son took over army duties. This 16-year-old would go on to be the most influential person in Western history. Alexander would unite Greece militarily by reinvigorating hatred for an old enemy, Persia. By this point, Greece had been fighting Spartans for a while. Alexander would lead an insane conquest of basically the entire known world, even catching and surviving malaria once. He made it all the way to India, spreading Greek influence everywhere. Eventually, after his generals complained enough, he agreed to turn back. Another theory posits that he made that up and really wanted to turn back himself to preserve his perfect 20-0 battle record, like Mayweather. I'm going to mispronounce this, but in his wake, the Maurya Empire formed, the largest in India's history. It was the route home that would spell his end. Around the Indus River Valley, Alexander's army came face to face with mosquito-borne diseases, with many dying. Alexander had possibly set his sights on an invasion of North Africa and continuing west. Can you imagine if that happened? We'd probably be living in a totally different world by now. It was on his return trip to Babylon that his army had to tread through the murky swamps near the city. This ill-fated trip would see Alexander be bitten by a mosquito carrying Plasmodium falciparum, and he would die on June 11th, 323 BCE at the age of 32, and the rest is history. His death would create a massive power vacuum, which later saw the rise of a little backwater village that would eventually become this kind of niche place called the Roman freaking Empire. But as much as Rome's rise was led by the mosquito and Plasmodium, it would also see itself fall in its influence. Starting as a humble clutch of villages, Rome would become one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. We all know that. By 1117 BCE, Rome's eastern borders hugged the Tigris River and the mouth of the Persian Gulf. At its zenith in 1117 CE, it had taken all of the Mediterranean coast and northern Africa up to Hadrian's Wall in Britain. The massive sprawling extent of its empire and thus trade routes gave great opportunity to our little blood-sucking friends. Almost 100 years before, during the Second Punic War, malaria had done work on Hannibal's army in multiple locations, so it's possible that without the help of malaria, Rome as we know it would have never existed. But that's not how it played out. For 700 years, Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East would be under Greco-Roman influence, in large part due to the help of the mosquito and its passengers. According to Timothy Weingard, an interesting cure for malaria practiced by Romans was to wear a piece of papyrus or an amulet with the word, I'm not kidding, abracadabra inscribed on it, thought to be a powerful incantation possibly coming from Aramaic meaning, I will create what I speak. So that's interesting. And malaria was an integral part of Roman life. Not even their mighty emperors were immune, with emperors like Vespasian, Titus, and Hadrian, and many more going through frequent bouts of it. Octavian or Augustus and the next emperor Tiberius had several episodes themselves. So why was Rome so consistently devastated by malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases? Well, possibly because of this. The Pontine Marshes, a massive string of swamps and marshes just outside of Rome. It provided great protection to the Eternal City, but also weakened its armies. Caesar himself actually planned on sending thousands of men to drain it before, being stabbed 23 times that'll usually kill you. The Romans also had a fondness for cisterns, fountains, gardens, baths, and ponds, while also employing large aqueducts and dealing with frequent natural floods. That only compounded this effect, and as the city and empire grew, large amounts of deforestation only added. Austin fun fact for you right here. Check it out. It's a little bird over there, I don't know what that is. You may have noticed some trends here, particularly in the environment people typically find themselves in when they contract malaria. Swampy marshes in most of the stories I've recalled spelled the end of any conquest or advance several times. But why? Well, let's get sciencey again, my friends. You've likely been to a marsh or swamp at some point, and especially if you arrive at dusk or dawn, you can see the disgusting amount of mosquitoes and insects out and about. Why is that? Well, for mosquitoes, they lay their eggs in the water, specifically stagnant or still water. Marshes, with their tightly packed vegetation, muddy shores, and general lack of outlets for water, have very stagnant water and flood often, which traps even more water. Mosquitoes will travel for miles outside of their marshy home to find a lovely blood snack, but their main home is marshes and swamps for these reasons. Mosquitoes have a massive range and exist on every continent except for Antarctica. They thrive in temperatures between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 to 26 degrees Celsius. This is the only time I'm helping out, you metric using sheeple, Imperial Superior, get with it. Mosquitoes tend to start getting inactive or die around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, below 10 and above 40 degrees Celsius. The relative temperature adaptability allows them to survive in most climates globally. Plasmodium, however, is more sensitive, especially our main killers. Plasmodium thrives in tropical environments, and the rate of reproduction inside its mosquito host depends on the temperature inside of the insect itself, which depends on the outside temperature. Insects, unlike mammals, can't control their own body temperature. And for falciparum, at about 72 degrees Fahrenheit, it needs around 3 weeks to effectively reproduce, which can be dangerous as that time frame is encroaching on the lifespan of the mosquito itself. Below about 66 degrees Fahrenheit, it can't survive. Vivax, however, can survive temperatures as low as 59 degrees Fahrenheit. This means that falciparum has been confined mostly to Africa, but has found some foothold in the Mediterranean climate historically in nations like Greece, South Spain, Portugal, and Italy. This makes those pesky pontine marshes a perfect environment for falciparum replication and spread. It is thought that this strain killed Alexander on his trek through the marshes near Babylon. So remember how I mentioned at some point in the 3 examples I gave earlier, in army marching through or near a large marsh? The resulting malarial outbreaks and subsequent destruction of those armies was no coincidence. Throughout human history, a significant portion of our battle with the main 15 mosquito-borne diseases has been caused through bites of only 2 species, Aedes and Anopheles, the latter being our main discussion point here. An important aspect to mention is that Plasmodium parasites can only be transmitted through the Anopheles mosquito. There are over 500 subspecies in the species Anopheles, only 60 of which can pass on the Plasmodium. In all honesty, I did an embarrassing amount of research as to why only Anopheles mosquitoes can give us malaria, assuming it was something complicated about like the mosquito's immune system or something, but I couldn't find anything at all. I literally looked for maybe 30 minutes until I just Googled what species of mosquitoes drink human blood, where I found only Aedes, Anopheles, and one other species actually target humans. Just even more evidence that I'm untrustworthy as a science and history communicator. Anopheles mosquitoes prefer to live in warm, humid environments with relatively stable year-round temperatures, much like those found in sub-Saharan Africa, the Mediterranean, and other tropical areas. Again, they plant their eggs in stagnant, clear water. Where else had stagnant, clear water and stable, warm, humid temperatures in the 3 historical events I mentioned? The marshes near Babylon, the marshes near Salamis, and the Palatine marshes near Rome, and the many aqueducts, ponds, fountains that decorated Rome, all covered in mosquitoes looking for proteins to make their eggs, all decimated by the destruction...
I really hate that chicken.
All decimated by the destructive power of Plasmodium, turning the tide of history. Those Palatine marshes near Rome that killed emperors and caused plagues, those would be the death of the empire, slowly chipping away at its population through mosquito-borne diseases while the government rotted from the inside, eventually making them easy prey for invaders. So now we're going to get into more of the history, but in a different way. Populations in Europe, Africa, and Asia had been dealing with Plasmodium and its effects for millennia. But let's see what happens when you introduce the deadliest disease in human history to a massive population who have absolutely 0 inherent immunity. I'm going to kill that chicken. Oh, I didn't start my teleprompter. Lol. Thanks to that one guy who gave me decent tips about the lighting on my last video. I appreciate you. I'd like to take you out on a date, and I'd like to give you a big ol' kiss. I hope you like this set. I've had fun. The pre-Columbian Americas had an odd lack of genuinely bad diseases in general. They had a runoff strain of tuberculosis, valley fever, Chagas disease, and syphilis, which did numbers in the old world after contact. It's thought that the lack of domesticated animals in comparison to Europe, Asia, and Africa gave diseases less chances to take the zoonotic leap over to humans.
As you probably already know, the lack of acquired immunity to diseases like smallpox, measles, malaria, and countless others meant that the massive populations across the Americas became easy prey for these maladies. But for this video, let's talk about the introduction of malaria and how it affected these populations. Remember that quote from the very beginning of the video? That was from Columbus's failed La Isabela settlement on Hispaniola. Find out more about that in my last video. If you don't, I will come to your house and violently attack you. In the report containing that excerpt, he explains how much it rained and how much his men quickly succumbed to tertian fever, or malaria as we now know, right? Like I explained earlier, tertian indicating 3 actually refers to a 48-hour symptomatic period. This time frame indicates that Columbus's men had contracted Plasmodium vivax. Given the timing, it is likely that these men contracted Plasmodium in Spain before departing. So, as soon as Europeans arrived and set up permanent settlements in the Americas, malaria had been released upon the unexpecting masses. White people, man, I can't. Ugh. Let's discuss an interesting idea proposed in 1493. This book is such a banger, folks. I only recommend bangers. As malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases, especially yellow fever, ravaged the Caribbean, Central, and South America, some pesky Englishmen were trying to set up shop on the east coast of the United States. I hate to be a shill, but if you want a pretty decent explanation into the environmental impacts of the founding of Jamestown, check out my last video. Remember, I will attack you violently, but I'll say this. One of the main reasons that Jamestown didn't end up a smoldering pile of redcoats is because of how successful their tobacco growing venture ended up being. It was on the shipments of settlers from England that Plasmodium would travel, inside its mosquito and human hosts. They didn't check carry-on luggage back then. The initial attempts at settlement were wrought with malaria and starvation, as well as bad winters, all the things that kill white people. Malaria began to spread very quickly westward, north, and south. The indigenous populations began to be decimated by the parasite. The case of Jamestown and malaria seems to be particularly bad. But why? Well, let's take a look at where exactly these colonizers came from. According to historian David Fisher at Brindle's University, about 60% of the initial wave of colonists to the east came from England's 9 eastern and southeastern counties, or as it is also known, England's Plasmodium belt. You may have noticed how I only talked about the environmental limits of Plasmodium falciparum earlier and not vivax. I've been saving it. In comparison to its much deadlier cousin, vivax isn't as fussy when it comes to temperature. Here's the survival threshold of falciparum again. The colder it gets, the longer it takes to reproduce, effectively in the mosquito, eventually reaching an amount of time not supported by the mosquito's lifespan. So while falciparum cannot reproduce well under 66 degrees Fahrenheit, vivax can go as low as 59 degrees. Well, that's not much. The temperature where I'm at can change that much in an hour. Well, what does that extra 5 degrees of resistance allowed vivax to do? It meant it was way more comfortable spreading in its European territory northward. While falciparum had to settle with living a cozy life on the beach of a Mediterranean coastal resort, vivax was able to spread to much cooler places like the Netherlands, England, even lower Scandinavia. As history would play out, American malaria would stem from 2 groups. Falciparum would come from the Africans, vivax would come from the Europeans. Southeastern England, before extensive draining efforts, consisted mostly of low-lying wetlands, where malaria was common. However, after draining efforts, the problem only worsened, as draining marshes tends to leave behind small, stagnant bodies of water. The principal mosquito of England's Plasmodium belt was Anopheles malceolpennis, the perfect vector for vivax. You may be wondering, if the English colonists on the East Coast had caught vivax in England, why didn't they show symptoms until they reached North America? Well, that's because vivax actually has a pretty unique ability among Plasmodium of being able to lay dormant inside a host for long stretches of time before attacking. So that explains how vivax took hold in New England and began to wreak havoc on indigenous populations as well as the colonists. But over time, especially by the 1670s, the colonists had learned to survive with the seasoning period of vivax.
or the initial symptomatic phase, and dropped deaths from vivax infections to only about 10% or lower. That was pretty good back then. But in the next decade, that percentage rose again. Historians attribute this heightened death rate to the arrival of vivax's deadlier cousin, falciparum. But before we get into the weeds with that, let's shift over a bit. Does anybody else live with other people and you're like recording out in the living room or something, and somebody comes home and then you just get really embarrassed about the fact that you are the lowest rank of society, that you make YouTube videos? I do, so this is my room. Yeah, so let's keep going on this. So we're going to discuss possibly the largest ramification of malaria in consequence to our modern world. To do so, unfortunately, you will have to listen to me talk about English people again. I'm going to take a Tums first. As the colonial era in the Americas had progressed, most of the best pickings had been snatched up already by the time England really began to make permanent settlements. They were actually the third European nation to arrive there in 1497 on the John Cabot voyage, where he landed in Newfoundland or Labrador, noted some fishing spots, claimed the land for King Henry VII, and got about 10 pounds as a reward for finding an island in what they thought was Asia, which apparently was a lot back then. It was actually pretty important for later English land claims in North America. But by the time the English arrived in the Americas again, the largest empires had been conquered. The largest mines were being exploited. In a decent sense, they were late to the party. Jamestown and its surroundings didn't have any nearby gold or silver, so the best way to profit was to export items from the colonies back to England. Oh, it's so stuffy in here, Jesus Christ. The Pilgrims in New England relied on selling beaver pelts. The Chesapeake Bay settlements relied on tobacco, and thus had a large need for more land and labor. Again, because I hate you, go watch my last video for more on this. Planting, cultivating, curing, and shipping tobacco is very labor intensive, and these colonists were looking for the best way to ease the effort. In their defense, they also had to focus on not dying pretty much all the time. Since they didn't exactly have the same moral standards as we do today, there were two main options for them: indentured servants from England or slaves from outside of England, such as indigenous groups or Africans. Just a reminder that I do not support slavery before any of you make any hasty assumptions, because some of you are a PhD level overreactor. So what's an indentured servant? It was essentially an unemployed person from England who signed a labor contract to work for planters, who paid for their voyages to the colonies, which was paid back by the servants through labor over a usual 4 to 7 year period. After that, they were free to claim their own land. Slavery is more difficult to define, as it has existed for almost all of human history for many different reasons. But some factors that have remained consistent is that people are owned by an individual who are allowed to coerce labor from them in any way, with the slaves never getting the right to leave. They must work until they are either freed or die. Indentured servants were at the low rank of society, but slaves weren't even considered people most of the time, just as property. As we know, England eventually turned to slavery over indentured servants, which is a little puzzling on the surface, not just on an ethical level, but also economically. According to Charles C. Mann, a study conducted by Russell R. Menard of the University of Minnesota tallied prices in Virginia and Maryland of servants and slaves, whose services had to be sold after the death of their masters. Open the window, it's so stuffy. Charles Mann relates, quote, "In the last decades of the 17th century, the average price of a prime-age male African slave was 25 pounds. Meanwhile, the servant's contracts typically cost around 10 pounds. He then puts in brackets, technically I should say that Menard discovered the price was equivalent to 25 and 10 pounds, because coins were scarce and even illegal in colonial Chesapeake Bay, and people paid their bills with tobacco. At the time, 25 pounds was a pretty substantial sum, about 4 years' pay for the typical hired worker in England. The servant was substantially cheaper. Menard also found that even though a servant would be free after their contract expired, lowering their value, they were still seemingly more economically valuable than slaves. The famous economist Adam Smith, pretty much the guy who invented capitalism, maintained that an inherent flaw in slavery is that the slaves themselves made for unsatisfactory workers. I am not saying this. A Scottish guy from the 1700s is saying this. Blame the capitalism guy. Thank you, monkey. Smith remarked how slaves were usually from distant cultures and didn't speak their owner's language, and were unfamiliar with their owner's culture. They would essentially have to be trained from scratch. They also had every incentive to sabotage, escape, and kill their owners. Indentured servants, on the other hand, spoke the language, knew the culture, and had largely agreed themselves to do the work, with the promise of being freed after a certain amount of time. And so they were more reliable. It was also the case that American slavery was practiced quite differently. Slavery in Africa and the Roman Empire was quite common, which of course means that the Confederacy is accused of guilt, since it has always been done. I'm not serious. Fuck the Confederacy. I'm simplifying a pretty insane amount here, but most slaves in Africa and Rome were captive soldiers, and were generally made to be soldiers again, still with the chance of earning glory. If anyone wants to elaborate in the comments, please do so. But American slavery, or chattel slavery, was a lifelong sentence, forcefully being worked in horrendous conditions without hope of freedom. Of course, not every plantation was the same, but no matter what, it was hell. So if there was an option that was cheaper, more reliable, and had less chance of failure in indentured servants, then why did the brutal system of chattel slavery of Africans become dominant? Yeah, it was probably malaria. Monkey, are you okay? I'm sorry, monkey. Interestingly, if there was any nation in Europe that was generally anti-slavery, it was England. For many reasons, but mostly it was just more advantageous to use indentured servants, and there was also a pretty deep societal hate for the constant capture of Englishmen by Barbary pirates in northern African waters, who then either killed or sold Englishmen into slavery across Ottoman Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa. Algiers alone had 1,500 English slaves at one time, the Moroccan town of Saleh another 1,500. It was never outlawed, however, just made economically unviable and rare. The Portuguese and Spanish took full advantage of the African slave trade to keep their populations of sugar plantation workers stable. It was a genuinely odd occurrence that England would eventually turn to the same system. The English colonies would initially use indentured servants, mostly avoiding slavery. In the first century of colonization, over a third of the Europeans who arrived in North America were indentured servants. In 1650, the small number of Dutch in New Amsterdam had 500 slaves, while there were only 300 slaves in all of Virginia, but over time, those numbers would slowly rise. Then suddenly, between 1680 and 1700, that number exploded. Virginia's slave population alone rose from 3,000 to over 16,000, and it wasn't slowing down. At the same time, the population of indentured servants shrank massively. Why? Well, it wasn't because of slavery's new economic importance. The sugar and textile industry were still far larger than any of the income brought in directly from slavery. This is an instance in history that has been discussed for decades by historians. Charles Mann brings up a couple of popular ideas. First, and less important in my opinion, it seems that the massive amount of real estate that America had to offer counteracted the system of indentured servitude itself. If these servants were allowed to claim their own land, they would do that as soon as their contract ended, instead of going back and working for someone else, which in England, that's generally how it went, as pretty much all the land was already owned. They would just go and work for somebody else. Those new landowners would then hire their own servants, and the cycle would continue, driving up demand for servants. At the same time, England found itself caught up in its own civil war, which drove down population and unemployment in England, driving up needed wages for servants. Apparent uncertainty in the silver trade also compounded this effect. I will discuss it at some point, it's pretty crazy. So rising prices and demand for indentured servants and more new landowners looking for workers made indentured servitude as a system suddenly economically difficult. The Little Ice Age also began to affect the economy for many reasons. As a result, newer, cheaper options began to be explored. This explains the switch to slavery as the popular model, but why Africans? Why not Scottish or Irish people who had been the popular option in England for quite some time? Well, they suffered the same fate as many Europeans in malarial areas. Let's go back to that sudden rise in malarial deaths in the English colonies. After figuring out how to survive the seasoning period effectively, another strain swooped in, falciparum. The founding of the Carolina colony was wrought with difficulty. Initially founded in 1670 by members of a stockholder company making their way from Barbados to take advantage of the very large amount of real estate, the colony was intended to be an exporter of cash crops. After arriving, they were immediately immersed into an incredibly complex social system of hundreds of indigenous groups. These groups were constantly fighting for power in the region, most stemming from the fragments of the former Mississippian societies. The arrival of Europeans meant to the indigenous groups an opportunity to trade for weaponry, especially guns. In return, they would usually trade the colonists' enslaved natives. While in regions like the Chesapeake Bay, where slavery was usually a temporary state, the many cultures of the southeastern colonies still practiced long-lasting slavery of war captives, likely continuing from the traditional Mississippian view of slaves as symbols of power and vengeance. Indigenous groups like the well-known Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, and more were most interested in newly invented European weapons like the flintlock rifle. They would trade slaves for these weapons to get an upper hand in warfare against other indigenous groups, where they would capture warriors, who would then be sold as slaves for more weapons, so on and so on. To the indigenous groups, these slaves were incredibly valuable. To the colonists too, who got a steady stream of forced labor, even asking some groups to attack others who were allied with French and Spanish forces to destabilize their European enemies. For its first 40 years, Carolina was a massive slave exporter, but it was short-lived. By 1715, the industry had almost totally vanished due to sharply declining indigenous populations and attacks from indigenous groups against the Europeans. And then came falciparum. Likely arriving on the East Coast with the first importations of African slaves, it made itself comfortable quickly. At first, the uptick in sickness was blamed on the Carolinian climate. It was more likely the new rice plantations that allowed the mosquitoes to thrive. The deaths piled up quickly, especially among the indigenous populations, many being absorbed into larger groups like the Creek and Choctaw, some disappearing altogether. With their industry of servants and native slavery now lost, they turned their eyes east to a population who could survive. Remember my explanation of Duffy Negativity and Sickle Cell earlier? I hope you were taking notes. It will be on the test. Those genetically acquired immunities to malaria are most common in West and Central African populations. They are almost completely immune to vivax and about half immune to falciparum. Plus, adding on more acquired immunity from years of exposure, adults in West and Central Africa were and still are more immune to malaria than anyone else on Earth. Unfortunately, that immunity became a large reason for their enslavement. The large part of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas from West and Central Africa. As falciparum began to take its toll on European and indigenous populations, population numbers of enslaved Africans rose dramatically. Although they were still dying in large numbers from other diseases and human brutality, they were still dying at a lesser rate than Europeans, with an exception: the Chesapeake Bay. Enslaved Africans tended to die quicker and more often than Europeans in Virginia and northward, possibly for several reasons like disease, poor nutrition and bad shelter, and trouble acclimating to the ice and snow. But in early summer, the ice and snow melted and the weather warmed, creating breeding grounds for mosquitoes. This was prime time to contract Plasmodium, and between August and November, the death rates of Europeans and Africans flipped as malaria season set in from the summer infections. Surveys and studies soon concluded that in the American falciparum zone, English colonists were 3 and 10 times more likely to die in their first year than Africans. This basically set in the system of importing Africans. Why import servants or slaves from other places that would die as quickly as the Europeans when you could import slaves almost completely immune to malaria? So you may notice I look a little different. My camera died while I was filming that last segment, so I didn't really get to finish it. And then my house flooded and I had to swim here. That's why my hair is wet. And that was about 2 days ago, so now we're here.
Which happens, dads leave. No need to be a pussy about it. Here's what I need.
So the result being that slavery and Plasmodium falciparum thrived side by side to a point. Falciparum could only establish itself for a few weeks out of the year in places like Atlantic City in New Jersey, but as close as Washington, D.C., only 120 miles south, it would become a massive yearly problem. Interestingly, the border dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania that created the Mason-Dixon line would, in a way, map the limits of falciparum. Coincidence? I think not. South of the line, malaria would become more than an epidemic. Smallpox, bubonic plague, measles, and other diseases could take hold, destroy population, and then leave, but malaria never left. It became endemic. North of the line, not so. A seemingly eternal cultural divide between Americans heavily influenced by the borders of Plasmodium. South of the line saw a labor force employed that could survive in the conditions better than their owners. North of the line, that labor force became more unreliable. South, the massive institution of chattel slavery took hold. North, the slow and eventual push away from slavery. Malaria didn't cause slavery. I feel that it simply strengthened it. The original importation of African slaves didn't occur due to an understanding of their inherent immunity to malaria, but over time it became obvious that the chattel slavery provided the largest advantage. The three largest spreaders of malaria in the post-contact Americas became Anopheles delingi in South America, Anopheles albuminus in the Caribbean, and Anopheles quadrimaculatus in Eastern North America, the northern limits of falciparum being the Mason-Dixon line, the southern limits being the Andes and upper borders of Argentina and Uruguay. I'd also like to say that American slavery, whether chattel or other types, would have still existed without the influence of malaria. Before its outlawing, slavery was very popular in colonial Massachusetts and Connecticut, even though there was little to no malarial season. Same applies to Argentina. No malaria, yet slavery until 1853. Every American colony had slaves for some amount of time, but the colonies where Plasmodium falciparum was common had far more, and the institution had much more staying power. Places like Virginia and especially Brazil would become defined by their reliance on slavery, unlike places like Massachusetts and Argentina. Malaria had massive effects on war as well. Union soldiers were wiped out in extreme numbers when they would cross the Mason-Dixon line into Confederate territory, and thus malaria territory. The effect malaria had on both indigenous and colonial populations is impossible to know, but the demon always seems to be present in our most influential moments. So let's take a look at what's currently going on with malaria. And wrap that up and give it to a kid on Christmas, because we're done. Let's go. God, this took me forever. Now you press play on the thing. Okay, and get your hands out of get your hands. Okay, so you deserve some academic honesty. My whole plan for this last chapter was to talk about the death tolls of malaria throughout history. But that type of information is kind of impossible to find. Decent numbers don't really exist before 1900. So instead, let's look at where malaria has been most prevalent since the beginning of the 20th century. But on this sick map from 1965. Just pretend it doesn't have borders from 1965.
So let's start here. The whole world. In my research, I sort of expected to find that the indigenous Americans were hit extremely hard by malaria, but that wasn't exactly the case. Of course, untold numbers of them died from the disease, but the numbers are probably much lower than I assume. This is probably because most didn't have the chance to catch it. Smallpox, measles, bubonic plague, and other diseases were the main contributor to the killing of 90 to 95% of indigenous Americans, going from a debatedly estimated 145 million people across the two continents in 1491 to 7 to 15 million at the end of the 1600s. Let me say that again. Over 130 million people died in only 200 years. While we will argue endlessly about what exactly caused that, disease from the old world is absolutely the main factor in indigenous genocide. But we cannot simply ignore the methods employed by colonial powers to systematically eliminate these people. If you live in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, etc., you are on native land. Gotta get over it. So beginning in 1900, these areas of the Americas were still malarious. The disease's range trimmed the west coast while inhabiting pretty much all of the contiguous United States east of the Rockies. Pretty much the entirety of Mexico, except for the Sierra Madre, and all of Central America, most of the Caribbean, and the entirety of northern South America above Argentina and the Andes. Moving to Eurasia, pretty much all of Europe except for the Alps and the Carpathian Mountains are home to malaria, the northernmost stretch being southeast England and southern Scandinavia. In Asia, everywhere besides the Himalayas is malarious, the cutoff being northern Siberia and Japan. Southeast Asia and India was especially affected. Large parts of the Middle East were as well, the Arabian Desert being too hot for it to stay around though. Australia proved to be pretty inhospitable for Plasmodium, as only the northernmost coastal part of the continent were home to it. New Zealand, like usual, was left out. Finally, Africa. It was and still is quite malarious, especially sub-Saharan, only absent in the Sahara and parts of South Africa. And so moving into 1965, the malarial empire has reduced significantly. Large efforts to drain swamps and other mosquito habitats, as well as insecticide implementation, have contributed massively. By now, the disease has been pushed out of Australia, all of Europe, most of Asia north of the Himalayas, and it has also vacated the United States and parts of northeastern Mexico and the Caribbean. Even in South America, its territory was trimmed in the coastal regions. Small chunks of Saharan Africa and South Africa have been freed as well. And finally, modern day. The empire is dying. The only place it's still prevalent are equatorial and tropical regions, the Amazon, India, Indonesia, and most of Africa, including poor Madagascar. They're still in its grip. These regions are consistently wet and humid, and it's probably impossible to force malaria out of these regions, and they will remain a stronghold. So now I can present one interesting solution that was actually brought on by nature itself. A common natural alkaloid muscle relaxer from South America secretly contained a cure. The Quechua-speaking populations of Peru and Ecuador have been using the ground bark of the cinchona tree as a muscle relaxer for millennia. First brought back to Europe in the 1570s, cinchona bark became popular for its medicinal properties, primarily being used as a cure for diarrhea. Don't laugh. It didn't find its true calling in Europe until the 1730s, after doctors in Lima noticed local Quechua people using the ground bark mixed in liquids to treat the shivers from fever. It happened to be the best cure for malaria then found, and the bark became a big import good from Peru. European scientists found the molecule responsible was called quinine, named after the Quechua word for the bark itself, quina or quina, meaning bark of bark or holy bark. Quinine works to stop Plasmodium from reproducing in your body, and has to be taken pretty consistently for it to work. And until about 1820, the method of ingestion was to grind the bark and drink it with a liquid, usually wine, just like the Quechua had been doing for so long. Can you scroll back up? This is going well. It's going okay.
Let's go.
Yeah, yeah. And some of these, and some of these. Almost there, and done. Okay, I thought I had a map of Africa, but I don't. Quinine didn't hit its stride until about the late 1800s, when it became widely commercially available in powder form and played a massively decisive role in the European colonization of Africa. Before quinine, Africa was seen as impossible to penetrate. It was literally called the white man's grave. This was mostly due to the massive amount of malarial regions that made quick work of Europeans. Until quinine, which allowed European nations to invade Africa without losing massive numbers of men and move into tropical areas for the first time, it's kind of crazy how bark from a random tree from the Andes used as a muscle relaxer would later be the main reason for African subjugation. Kind of wild how history works. Quinine was used a lot until around the 1940s when more effective medications came about. It's not recommended as a first-line treatment for malaria anymore, mostly because of its nasty side effects. If you took quinine, you could possibly experience headache, vision issues, ringing in your ears, sweating, and more rarely deafness, low blood platelet levels, and weirdly an irregular heartbeat. It also makes you more susceptible to sunburns for some reason. But granted, if you're white, that's just kind of a side effect of existing. It is so hot in here. Oh my god. However, it is still used in the absence of artemisinin, which are the more modern, more effective drugs used to cure malaria. Quinine is still used to treat arthritis and lupus apparently, so our boy has still got it. That brings me back to our map. These areas that are still ravaged by malaria today shouldn't have to suffer. There are dozens of drugs to help ease and cure the many varieties of malaria, all being mass-produced, but hardly any get to where they really need to go. Over 600,000 people still die from malaria annually, most under the age of 5, and we shouldn't let these people suffer, so please, I will urge you again to donate at least a little to the charities I've linked in the description. Again, only $2 will buy a mosquito net that could potentially save somebody's life. So, while malaria is likely here to stay, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to help those in need. Yay!
Damn. Look at Austin and Tom.
I mentioned that like 3 times. Seriously, only $2 you get somebody a mosquito net. Like where it's most common in like Africa, they don't have the medications. So that's where most of the people die is here, but it's also like here and shit, and in India. Diseases like smallpox, measles, the bubonic plague all caused massive epidemics, but they eventually faded. Malaria has become more than an epidemic in every part of the world. It has become endemic, a constant threat that will never leave. It has influenced some of the largest and most consequential events in human history. And we have put some of our most coordinated efforts forward, but to no avail. Our demon will always be with us, looking over our shoulder, twisting our plans. All we can do is ease the suffering of those most affected. We have our best success when we work together, so let's do our part and help our fellow humans. I hope you enjoyed this video. I apologize for how long it took. I've been busy with school and work, but thank you for all the support you guys have given me. I genuinely do appreciate it. If you want to check out my Patreon to help me pay for my college tuition, go right ahead. Anyways, have a nice day. We'll see ya.